Hey everybody, I'm Sean Robinson.
I'm Carson Grubaugh. Welcome to Living the Line. Sean, you've got a human being in the room with you. What's going on here?
I do. Tom, will you
Hey,
please introduce yourself with a nice, thorough pronunciation of your last name so we can all get it?
sure. I am Tom Kaczynski, and I'm a cartoonist, and I also run Uncivilized Books, and I do a whole bunch of other things too. I do some writing, other things. But Kaczynski, Tom Kaczynski.
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 Yeah.
Tom, I first saw your stuff. I hate to tell you, I didn't pay for your book because I.
Damn it.
It was the one that got away. I got a copy of your first book that came out through Fantagraphics. This is the current one that you can buy. Beta testing the ongoing apocalypse.
This is probably what you got.
That is the one that I got right there. Beta testing the apocalypse. I got this because I used to write for the Comics Journal, and you guys might know that Gary doesn't pay people to write for the Comics Journal. You get books. You get a nice choice
Yep.
of a book. So it was actually it was fantastic. I remember getting a copy of this and Heart of Thomas. The Moto Hagio book. I think those are the two, and history. The guy Bill Everett, who created the Namor.
Submariner.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
And this
The
is
spread.
fantastic. Yeah, it was great. I was like in heaven, you know. Yeah, and I just the first impression that I had of this first printing was just like I liked it so much that I felt a little bit like I didn't have to do a bunch of stuff that I had like thought about before. Like what, you imagine like what type of stuff you want to do. It was like, oh, he's got it covered. Like there's just such a breadth of stuff in here. If anybody has not checked out Beta Testing the Apocalypse, this is the new one, Beta Testing the Ongoing Apocalypse. I don't want to speak for you, but how would you characterize these stories? I mean, there's obviously a wide range of science fiction-y short stories.
Sure. I mean, I just, my kind of like elevator kind of take on it is, essentially science fiction 5 minutes in the future. It's a little bit future, it's a little bit now, and it all kind of takes place in the same kind of headspace. There's actually a lot of little small things that connect the stories together, and but not like in a super obvious way. And sort of just kind of grappling with the kind of the present as a kind of an ongoing apocalypse, essentially, and in many different ways. There's the stories kind of vary in many different ways. And there's like a gentrification horror stories. There's kind of like apprehension about the climate. Sort of like a car apocalypse,
Which
et cetera,
seems to
et cetera.
feature the Mall of America, which I didn't actually realize until I moved to Minnesota. I started picking out certain things in your stories that were clearly at least somewhat derived from your
Yeah,
residency
yeah,
here.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, so I mean, it's obviously some of this is based on, sort of personal experiences, but it's all been kind of fictionalized for this collection. So none of it is like strict autobiography or anything like that, but it's picks up on my biography in some ways. I definitely think, just to kind of broaden it a little bit, I definitely think that science fiction is sort of the fiction of today, in the same way that sort of realist fiction was the fiction of maybe the 19th and 20th century. Science fiction is kind of the fiction of the 21st century. It's kind of the medium where we can kind of understand the weird things that are happening in the world today. So that's kind of why I generally gravitate towards science fiction, although not always. I do a bunch of stuff around theory, around I do some autobiography, some kind of like essay-like comics, things like that. So,
Well, and it's definitely like I guess the thing I was kind of alluding to the first little bit there is that there's definitely a niche in the, let's just call it the art comics scene, where there's obviously science fiction being made in comics, but it's more like science fantasy or sort of pop sci-fi, where you have the trappings of it, but it's a Western, or you have the trappings of it and it's actually essentially like a watered down Tolkien story,
sure.
with laser guns or whatever. Whereas, the thing that was kind of striking to me is that you're sort of taking the art comics, like laser focus on this particular thing and having obviously your own aesthetic sensibility and everything like that, and applying that to the science fiction world. Where's, I mean, what science fiction even is in that environment? Like, what is there another? Who are your peers in that sense? You know what I mean?
I don't know. I'm not sure in comics. I mean, Daniel Clowes definitely does a little bit of this, right? Like with, David Boring, even like at the very end, they kind of end up in this weird kind of island. There's some kind of pandemic in the world. Or the more recent book that had some time travel in it and stuff like that. But it always kind of brings it back to a little bit of a sort of like present moment of kind of grappling with contemporary things. But it has these science fictional elements that almost serve as certain metaphors for states of mind or things like that. So I mean, he does this. I mean, obviously Chris Ware does this as well. He has those little Mars stories. He's got the what's the guy with the Rocket Sam stories, things like that, where he kind of pulls in some sci-fi from the old days, but then kind of contemporizes it and kind of tinges it with the kind of the Chris Ware kind of morbid personality, sort of everything is terrible, or everything will perish kind of thing.
This is a pull quote. Did he ask you for a pull quote?
So I think a lot of the sort of I mean, and they were guys that I was reading when I was younger, so it definitely kind of filters through. Then also on top of that is I was reading a lot of J.G. Ballard. I don't know if you
fantastic,
yeah. So Ballard is a huge influence, kind of going back pretty far.
And he's similar. I think the thread I see with Ballard is not just the contemporary thing, with obviously like he's speaking to his moment as well as the future, but also your willingness to just go all in on that particular concept. Like Ballard, doesn't just put somebody orbiting the Earth endlessly. He like makes it tiny. You know what I mean? He like shunts off all the other stuff and just makes it the laser focus on the
right. Yeah, like Crash with cars and things like that. So yeah, Ballard is definitely a huge influence. So that's kind of all kind of filters into my work.
Gotcha.
I think the thing that sets Tom's work apart from all those other comic artists, at least that you mentioned, is you're bringing in the philosophy and the theory in a way, and then especially in beta testing the ongoing apocalypse, you're very conscious of like the psychological consequences of design on the human creature. And I'm curious to hear you talk about that a little bit. It's something that I've thought a lot about lately, why we have this tendency. Like the one story I'm thinking about in particular is they put up this apartment building and it actually makes everyone around them more depressed and miserable. And I've noticed that we tend to design the world around us in a way that makes us more miserable, like frequently. And that's a really weird instinct we have. And I'd like to hear you talk more about the relationship between those two things.
Sure. So the story you're referring to is 976 square feet, where there's a huge condo building that's being built in a neighborhood. And this was actually a real experience. We were living in this small neighborhood in New York, and there was a huge condo going up, just kind of like creating havoc in the whole neighborhood. One thing to kind of, I guess I could say is that, I studied architecture in college. So, I come from kind of an architectural background. So a lot of these kind of design decisions, especially around architecture and around urban planning and around kind of designing human spaces, is something that I'm kind of acutely aware of at all times. Even if I'm not a practicing architect, it's something that I think about a lot and kind of deploy in my comics in some ways. I think it's I don't know that we can. I don't know that we're always intentionally trying to make ourselves miserable when we do these things. Obviously, the space is designed in this building where probably somebody thought they were going to be great for somebody, right?
Yeah.
At the same time, there is kind of, especially with cities, there's kind of a tendency. Cities essentially fill up over time, right? So like space becomes a premium to have space in a city. It becomes more and more difficult to to have it. And eventually things start going vertical, right? And then you essentially start creating these multi-layered cities. And the people who were there first, they're gonna start getting shadows from those tall things, and the people who are living on top may actually enjoy it, and have a very different experience of the same space. So it on some level it is kind of the progress of time. Things change and things evolve and things decay and things grow, and the old things accrue, they're the ones who eventually get swept away in some way. So I don't know that it's I mean there are obviously very if you kind of look at the history of urban planning, there are very deliberate schemes to kind of like get rid of neighborhoods and things like that. But almost in all of the cases, there is some kind of almost a utopian motive behind it, So, like if you look at an architect like Le Corbusier, right, who kind of wanted to recreate Paris with these gigantic blocks, and you can say like that's monstrous, but at the time, it was like seen as like weirdly progressive because everybody else was living in squalor in these shitty old buildings, and here's this guy bringing you these beautiful gigantic buildings. They're going to be surrounded by green, and supposedly that's going to be great, and then now 50 years 100 years later we look at that scheme and it's like this is monstrous, but at the time it was kind of a very utopian scheme in a way to kind of bring housing to the masses and make everybody happy.
That's very interesting. Like, not knowing you were an architect, it was one of the things I was going to ask you about. Because so your current series, Cartoon Dialectics, do I understand that most of the things that are in Cartoon Dialectics are intended to be part of Transterra eventually?
Hopefully, we'll see. I don't know. Like I'm kind of Transterra is this ongoing project that started a long time ago as mini comics, and I've just kind of been building on this. And I probably have over 300 to 400 pages drawn on at this point. And I'm kind of jumping between ideas, and sometimes these ideas cohere together and sometimes they're not. So some of this stuff I'm going to discard, and it's all going to get edited into something more coherent. But at some point I stopped trying to create a complete work, and I just started kind of just developing these ideas,
right?
Because I didn't know how they cohered together. So I'm just kind of throwing a lot of things out there, and eventually it'll cohere into something. But yes, potentially it might be
okay, well, potentially part of Transterra,
yes.
Actually involves discussing of Baron Haussmann transforming Paris by carving 80 kilometers of spacious boulevards and public space out of the urban fabric.
Right.
And you've got this really great drawing of a pre Haussmann Paris. And then it's, what looks like it's just been plowed over. Right. And, we haven't mentioned, your design sensibility, but like, obviously that really informs your comics. One of the things that I was aesthetically like really attracted to Beta Testing the Apocalypse is your use of spot color. And essentially like every story in the first printing of the book has the black plate and the spot color plate. And you're using the spot color not just for, shading or filling up, so so they don't have to do laborious cross-hatching or whatever, right. But you're also using it in the storytelling sense in every, like the characters will inhabit some new feeling or some object will be imbued with the color.
Right.
So how did you start thinking about spot color as, part of your sort of arsenal? And what is it like to live in a world that's like being deprived of it?
Well, I started out mostly as, like in my early kind of uses of it were basically like, I'm just shading, I'm just using it as a kind of a shading thing. But as my work got a little bit more conceptual, I started, to think like, okay, well, I could shade it, or I could really spotlight a specific element or moment or whatever in a very specific way. And kind of give another layer to the meaning, in the images, beyond just like, this looks roughly, correctly lit or whatever, you know what I mean? So the lighting kind of aspect of it is still there when it makes sense, but it also isn't just another tool to kind of add another layer of meaning, mostly as a kind of a highlight or something like that.
And a design element. So I want to go back to the architect thing then. That I didn't know that.
Damn it,
we're
Sean,
gonna
you took
do
us
this
off
the whole
the-
time because like my
Sorry.
interests are completely different than Sean's here, I think.
Tell me about the paper, Tom.
Yeah, but I'm really interested in that because one of the other things that I noticed throughout, but especially in beta testing, the ongoing apocalypse, is this awareness always of the ontological status of things. Like the especially the one about cars is an ontological analysis of cars, which is a very funny thing to do. Was that part of the architectural training in constructing spaces, or is that just in your kind of studies on your own that you've picked up those kind of ideas?
Yeah, I mean it's a little bit out of architecture. You know, when I went to school, you know, I kind of went in the 90s, and all artistic disciplines in the 90s were definitely suffused with like postmodernist theory. You know what I mean? It was just a huge part of even if you didn't want to like engage with it, it was part of classes, it was part of readings, it was part of everything that you kind of did. So I picked up a little bit of that there, but I also was interested in it as a, you know, as a kind of a armchair philosopher. And I would read a lot of that stuff. And I did do a minor in critical theory and sort of those architecture, critical theory minor. And I also I double majored in art and architecture. So it's definitely something that I, you know, constantly kind of sort of engage with, you know, at least since college, if not before. You know, I mean, before I was reading maybe less philosophy, but more, you know, more kind of like existential fiction or something like that, which also kind of on some level deals with things like this, but maybe not as explicitly. So yeah, so like, you know, I definitely think about, especially in beta testing, that book, sort of the ontological status of the apocalypse was always important, like kind of important, like, you know, it was important to sort of decide, like, are these characters going through an actual apocalypse, or is this sort of like a first world apocalypse, or is this like is this just something that's in their heads, you know what I mean? So you know, this kind of push and pull between, like, is this real, is this not real, was you know, does this exist, or is it just in your head? That was always kind of an important part of this particular book, especially.
And can you explain that concept succinctly? I don't know if that's possible, but I feel like there's people watching that are like, what in the fuck are they talking about? Because like, or you say the metaphysical status of something, usually people attach that to ghosts and that kind of metaphysics, but there's a very different use of that word.
Well, I'm using metaphysics in like in a philosophical sense, right? So like, you know, ontology is really kind of like a part of metaphysics, in the sense that, you know, an ontological status of something is essentially like, does this thing exist? Is this something that's real, or is this something does it have any kind of you know, being? Does it exist in the world? You know, that's opposed to something like epistemology, which is more about knowledge, right? Do we know that this thing like what is the knowledge of this thing? You know, so like if we talk about, you know, like simple objects, like something like I don't know, a chair, right? A chair, like we, you know, it's you know, we can measure the chair, right? We can measure it, we can do all kinds of things, we can kind of create epistemological knowledge about the chair. And then, you know, ontologically, like we, you know, if we're going to sit on it, you know, sort of interact with it, we know that it probably exists in some fashion, right? Because we can discern it physically. But then there's other kind of, you know, there's concepts that are maybe ontologically ambiguous, you know, things like, you know, for many people, God would be something like that, right? Does God exist? You know, Superman. Well, Superman is, you know, it's more of a fiction, I mean, it does have an ontological status because, like, you
It
know,
does.
there is, like Santa Claus, right? Like
Right.
Santa Claus doesn't exist, we think, but however, everybody does get presents every
Now I gotta click
every
on the
Christmas.
this is not for kids button on YouTube.
But you know, somehow everybody still gets presents, right? So even though, like, you know, the adult would say like, oh, Santa doesn't exist, still everybody gets presents, and so there is some kind of reality to the concept of Santa Claus, you know. And it's, you know, because we all decide that, like, we want Santa to exist in some way, so we all buy presents and we put him under the tree or whatever.
Yeah.
So, you know, so these more ambiguous concepts like the apocalypse, you know, the capitalism, communism, those kinds of things, like, you know, they're a little bit more kind of uncertain. Like, are we in an apocalypse? You know, a lot of people would say yes, we are going through an apocalypse, but then there's a lot of people who would be like, no, things are actually going pretty good, you know, like, look at this, we've got all this technology, we've got all this, you know. So you know, everybody kind of will have different, you know, will assign different ontological kind of like importance to these things. Maybe they all agree that it exists, but maybe it's not as important, you know. So does that make sense? Does that
Yeah, I mean, I get it. I just, for people watching, and the other thing is the analysis that you do is really interesting, because you're talking about not just does it exist, but the way within which it exists, and also like how it exists within a certain context. So like the way you break down what like it is to exist as a car in a certain context is really interesting. And I think that's part of, if you're going to define apocalypse, then you have to say, you gotta, like, who's talking about what, and part of that is in relationship to its surroundings. Like, you can never isolate, yes, this exists, it's like, exists in what context. And like, I feel like your work is very, very good at doing that in a way that I've never seen in comics, for sure.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I mean, you know, I don't know, like, I definitely think about systems too, and this, I mean, this goes back to architecture, you know, like, we always have to kind of interact with the built environment, and, you know, a lot of times that environment is not something that we built, right? We're interacting with something that somebody else built. So and this goes, you know, this, you can kind of take that analogy and go further, you know, and think about the, you know, the social structures, political structures, etc. All these things we kind of inhabit, and they're things that we inherit from our ancestors and our and people who, you know, either impose these things on us, or maybe they're emergent properties, or there's something else, you know. But I'm always kind of hyper aware, and, you know, at this point, I don't know, like, it's like a broken brain kind of thing. Like, I'm just so aware of it all the time that I just assume to, you know, that almost like I kind of have to think about it in some fashion, and it always kind of bleeds into the work.
Does it make it difficult sometimes that you ever have like social relationships where people have just told you to stop talking about how they're, you know, how their space is killing them? Or have you managed to sort of massage your social relationships to
I don't necessarily have to like bring this into like every relationship, you know, like this is something I think about in my work. You know, I write about it, I make comics about it, you know, I talk on video channels about it, but it doesn't have to inform every single one of my, you know, relationships. Like, I think, you know, person to person, like, you meet someone, you know, they're gonna be what they're gonna be. They're gonna have the kind of, you know, they're going to just be the person that they are, and you still have to, you kind of have to give them an ontological reality, and they're going to come from whatever environment they come from. And I think it's important to give them the space to do whatever, you know, to kind of be there and interact with you in a kind of a human way. And I think that's important. I mean, that's another, you know, it's like, are we human, you know, like, what makes us human? And part of that is just being social, being able to talk to other humans on a, you know, without kind of these abstractions getting in the way, and sometimes they do, obviously, but I think it's important to sort of try not to insert these huge things that a lot of us don't have control over, into, you know, and kind of into the relationship of just being there one-on-one with the person.
Well, Carson, I'm tempted to try to tie our two strands here together, so that I get a chance to pull out my strand a little bit further.
Go.
I think that their philosophy and architecture have more than a passing acquaintance with design, I think that there is a certain kind of abstraction that is easier for someone who is engaged with design in a ground up kind of way. I used to have this argument with a professor that I had in college. I had a design course, and I believe that the way that I finally severed this argument with him was just telling him it's responsive design. I'm responding to the materials. I didn't design this ahead of time. It's responsive. Go away. You know, like that there will be there's a separation between the sort of like I think the breaking point we had is when I took a clock and set it on fire and wrote "fuck Frank Lloyd Wright" on the face of the clock, and
art
gave
school.
You know, but that was like the division for me. It's like, did you make this from the ground up so that it can stand and have a particular function from the starting point, or did you respond to the materials at hand and create something out of the event and the event itself? Now, obviously, like, you know, you have very sophisticated writing, you have very sophisticated like design approach. You obviously have that architectural envisioning, but you also seem to have like a responsive hand to the cartooning. I mean, it doesn't look like labored stuff. I mean, maybe some of the stories, like the early stories, but like your newer stuff doesn't look like labored. So like, do you think that that's a fair division, that like Frank Lloyd Wright is sitting on one side of the fence and responsive materials is responsive design is another type of design, or are these like two separate things?
So you're putting Frank Lloyd Wright with the bad guys?
I like him. He's a good version of the bad guy. He's not a bad guy. No, you need that. You need that, right? Because you can't have a book if you don't have pagination, right?
Right.
You can't have a car if you don't figure out how much weight the axle can bear. I'm not shitting on Frank Lloyd Wright. I'm saying maybe I was when I was 22 years old or whatever.
Yeah.
I'm saying that it's almost like there's two separate paths of, you know, is it just that one isn't designed? How do you engage both those things, you know?
Yeah, I mean, you know, honestly, I would put Frank Lloyd Wright on the responsive side, in the sense that he is, I mean, one of the things he's sort of most famous for is sort of the prairie style architecture, right? Which is, you know, very much responding to the climate, to the region, to where it kind of was born, you know. So I mean, I get the point, in the sense that materials have their qualities, right? Mm-hmm. And something emerges from those things, and you should, you know, I don't think you should, because I guess you can do whatever you want, but, you can kind of like learn from the materials in a way, right? Like the brush is going to have a certain kind of line, and trying to kind of force it to do something else doesn't make sense. You know, and that goes for, you know, any other kind of tool you want to use. So for me, I'm definitely, like over the last few years, I've been kind of pushing a little bit away from over laboring on certain things. And you know, one way to do that for me is to work on this Transterra project, which is just fairly loose. You know, it's not, you know, I don't have like this structured story. There's certain concepts I want to kind of engage and work with. So these things kind of grow naturally out of the research that I do, out of the writing, the drawing that I do. And then the kind of drawing I decided to deploy for it is actually fairly, you know, it's supposed to be fairly quick. I'm just working with a rapidograph. I do some loose pencils underneath. But when I started, I didn't even do that. It was just mostly just direct to ink. I think the first maybe 4 issues were done direct to ink, like the first.
Well, let's see.
I'll show you.
I don't think I've seen the
these are the old. These have not been published in a while, but they're kind of like
Trans-Alaska.
This is
Ooh.
Trans-Alaska. This is Transatlantis.
Wow.
They're very small.
What was the scale of the original art? Is it the same as the...
These are probably shrunk roughly, I don't know, 60, 70,
Okay.
50 to 60%, something like that.
And are some of these in the cartoon dialectics, or these are separate things?
These ones are different. This is different. The cartoon dialectic stuff is newer. I'm probably going to collect these into some kind of book form, because there's enough pages now. There's probably like around 200 pages of that stuff that's not in print right now.
Okay.
But it could sit as a kind of an opening salvo of a sort, and then I can continue working on that. I definitely have a lot of people who are like, when did that stuff come out? That are asking me for it. So I think I need to put it in print, just because it's hard to kind of build this thing with the readers too, if they don't have access to that material.
Please do. I would love it.
Yeah, I'm going to.
Do you know a publisher? I mean,
I don't know. I've never heard of any publishers. But
Tom's a publisher.
but yeah, so very deliberately, these are relatively quick drawings, where I'm trying to be a little bit more iconic with the characters, with the concepts, etc. Whereas the beta testing stuff is a little bit more labored. It's brush, more brush, and takes me a little bit longer to get all the pages done. The pages are much larger. They're like, I don't know. Some of them were done at like the 11 by 15 size. Some of them are actually bigger than that.
Yes, and some of those stories, like in comparison to the stuff you're doing now, I mean, like you obviously have worked out like detailed perspective and right. Like
yeah, there's just no room for that on the other comics. I mean, there's some minor things I can do, but I can't do like a big perspective shot in the smaller comics.
Well, I mean, I guess if we're
I can suggest perspective.
Right. Well, I mean, if I'm going to be allowed to take my supposition that these are two different pathways of creativity that can also both be labeled some type of design, you feel free to argue with me in the comments. Then it seems like this newer project is a more balanced form of those things. If the beta testing stuff is a little bit more heavily on the architecture side, then this one might be sitting between the maybe like your process changing might have added the responsive elements in a stronger fashion.
Yeah, I mean, it's more responsive in the sense that it's easier to edit, right? Like, and redrawing a panel is not a big deal because it's a small panel, it's done quickly. So if I have to edit some, idea or whatever, it's pretty easy. With beta testing, once you're a few pages in, you've got those big pages drawn, it's taken a long time, it becomes a lot more difficult to kind of edit. Although I've done some extensive edits in that, like, actually the car story was completely written one way first, and then I rewrote, and I kept the art, but I rewrote the whole thing again. Rewrote all the script after it was done, and that happened a couple of times. But also like beta testing definitely sits more squarely in the sort of the fiction world, right? I mean, I am dealing with sort of fiction about. It's almost like fiction about theory versus like being more directly theoretical in even though I'm doing both in both projects, one has more of a fiction emphasis, the other one has more of a theory emphasis. So,
but it seems like the thing that Sean's poking at, you've given yourself a structure in both projects.
Yes,
where there is that more architectural pre-planned view that within it you can shuffle, like there's like a modular element to it that can be responsive. Like even I'm assuming, I haven't seen beta testing the Apocalypse, but I'm assuming the ongoing Apocalypse added new material. So
yeah. There are three new stories, and then there's like 10 pages of notes.
So that project can still be edited too. So there's a structure that contains everything. And I'm getting the sense that when you're talking about this this other project that you're still working on, it has the same thing. You're like, I've got 400 pages, but some of them are going to be edited, some of them taken away. I could put it out in cartoon dialectics and then take it away in another one.
Yeah.
So it seems like there's not just like Sean, you're talking about just the material level, but you can scale that concept up to
Yeah.
like the kind of curatorial level of the whole thing. And it seems like there's a structure there that allows responsiveness within the curatorial level.
I think that it's a natural like place of inquiry for comics, because comics are so labor intensive on the face of it versus the amount of time that somebody actually you know engages with it or whatever. And so I'm often curious about how people's practices adjusts for our need for a certain amount of spontaneity. Like for instance, like the first time that I heard that Chris Ware didn't do layouts, you know, in advance, I was horrified. And then when I actually sat down and thought about how labor intensive each of his pages are, it started to make a little bit more sense that he would give himself some element of freedom. And just because mentally I wouldn't be able to hang with that doesn't mean that he's not able to make a perfectly structured story just in words, and then, you know, have that element that enables him to have a little bit of sort of breath, you know, because I feel like there's a certain aspect to it where, especially if you end up like, you know, I mean, a poor like manga artist who has a weekly schedule or something like that, there's a certain element where you start to feel like you're just watching your body do the thing that it needs to do. And it seems like building in some kind of, you know, like I'm saying, building in some type of freedom responsive to respond to the moment is a sort of key to longevity. You know.
I mean, I'm sure every artist kind of has a little bit of, you know, something that takes them out of it a little bit in a good way, right? Like you're saying, Chris Ware doesn't do layouts. I mean, you know, he clearly does a lot of work, and he's probably done layouts before, but maybe he doesn't do layouts now. And you know, it's kind of an evolution of the practice, right? Like at some point, you just kind of like, well, I'm already, you know, he's so rectilinear with everything, right? That it's like, it's, you know, somewhere he's got to give himself a little bit of freedom to kind of play around. And maybe that's at the very beginning where he's just kind of like, you know, riffing on it or whatever. And then later on, he really has to tighten up, you know, and every artist is going to be a little bit different. You know, someone like, I don't know, like Paul Pope or something, you know, he's got such a fluid brush line or something, you know, like he's giving himself a lot of freedom kind of at the finish stage, you know, where he might need to, I don't know his process entirely, but he might need to tighten up a little bit in the beginning to kind of like make sure everything is down, and then he can like really kind of go, you know. So it just depends on, you know, obviously depends on kind of your art style, kind of your sensibility, where, you know, kind of where the fun is, right? Like, is the fun in the rendering, or is the fun in the figuring it out? Or, you know, because some artists, I know there's artists who just like cannot stand the writing part and they love the drawing part, right? So that's, you know, it's like where is the fun, you know?
Where is it for you?
I mean, I do, you know, once everything is figured out, there's a kind of a pleasure to the rendering, to just kind of like the inking, you know, the finish, and there's definitely a lot of kind of stress in the writing, and maybe, you know, maybe this is why I haven't finished this project yet, but yeah, there's definitely a lot of back and forth there, but like, you know, once everything is down on paper, then it's like, it's almost like a pleasure to kind of like finish it up, you know, kind of like now it looks good, it flows or whatever, you know, like you're just kind of like setting it in stone at that point in ink, you know. And that's the I don't, you know, I'm a lot less stressed out when I'm inking than when I'm kind of like penciling or whatever, when I'm, you know, trying to figure it out. And I don't want to over stress the word stress, because I'm not that stressed. It's just, you know, it's like you kind of like, comparatively speaking, one is an activity where you can even like listen to something else and kind of like zone out and go into this like flow state. Where the other one is a lot more conscious and you know, like I can't listen to any music, anything at all. Like you just have to have a quiet room and figure out what goes on paper.
Yeah, there are people who have told me personally that they enjoy writing. I don't believe it, because I just think they must be liars, or they're writing for their own gratification in some way that I don't understand, because it's torturous, right? You have to close off all stimuli, and just sort of drain yourself of the things that give you, you know,
I don't know. I mean, it can be torturous for sure. I mean, like,
or is it
it's
just
weird.
torturous for people who have squirrel brains like me?
Maybe it's just you. I don't know. But for me, like, I definitely there's different, like when I'm writing an article, that's a lot more stressful to me than I'm writing a comic. Like when I'm writing a comic, a lot of the writing in comics is visual, right? So you kind of have to. A lot of times I will draw whole sequences without words, and then the words will have to be filled in later. Right. I know what's going to happen from page to page to page, and then the torturous part is like, what are the words that go along with this? That can be a lot more stressful. But there are moments where I'm like, I know what I want to say, I just don't know how I'm going to visualize it, and then it becomes more difficult to kind of like figure out the visuals. So it's kind of a push and pull, like it's never the same, at least for me. And I don't have like one process for that. I don't have like, well, some people are just like, I write the script, I draw the thumbnails, and I draw, and my process is just never that simple. So
It looks to me like on Instagram recently, you've been posting some of the process of figuring out how to visualize certain concepts. Is that correct? You've been posting these little, like, how do I show a dense philosophical concept with like 2 characters and a couple arrows?
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I started doing this in sketchbooks a long time ago, and I've just kind of been bubbling it up. And I started this strip called Aesthetic Education that I run in the Uncivilized Books newsletter every time I put one out.
Subscribe now.
And yeah, they're just like really simple, kind of stick figure strips where the characters just talk more conceptually about things, and sometimes they do things conceptually, sometimes other things happen that are conceptual, but like basically trying to like visualize these bigger ideas through these smaller, more iconic things. It's a little bit, I've been reading a little bit about the formation of language, about hieroglyphics and things like that, and I'm trying to kind of like play with this idea of creating a kind of a very simple language that incorporates text, but also these very iconic visuals into something.
My favorite of these so far is the aesthetic education that is in the first cartoon dialectic series, issue 2, and this one has a murder sequence, but also has this man-god continuum. And I won't read the whole thing, but it's very funny. You have essentially like, I am God Emperor on one side, and the very bottom, I am richer than God, and at the very lowest at the top, at the totem pole, we have a diagram that shows us how these two concepts connect to each other through someone's ascension through humanity's ranks, or descension through humanity's ranks.
Yeah, you can see it either way, right? Like
Right.
you can definitely, it could have been created as a kind of a loop in a way. But yeah, exactly. Like, it's like, thinking about history, how things change in history, thinking about, just like having a really simple way to just kind of plot out these things. And then eventually some of these ideas may grow into bigger strips or whatever. But like, this is just kind of a simple way to kind of nail down a concept or something.
When you're working that way, is the writing, it seems, looking at those, that the writing and the drawing can't be separate in that mode. Like you kind of, like you said, there's a connection to pictograms, so you kind of have to be, I would assume, does that all happen at once when you're working on in that mode?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the strip, but a lot of times it's just me drawing that stick figure once, and maybe that figure's walking, maybe it's standing, maybe it's whatever, and it's like I'm probably just have read some book or something, and I'm thinking about an idea, and and I want to try to visualize it in some way, and then it just kind of grows from there, and yeah, it's pretty organic. Like it's, I'm not, yeah, just the drawing really, like to me, and this is kind of that comics as technology of consciousness essay, but drawing to me is kind of a technology of understanding something, right? So like, so when I draw something, a lot of times it clarifies things, like especially if I diagram an idea or whatever, like it just creates sometimes the drawing is like this, it's not that, right? Like it's very clearly like, okay, now I know it's not this because it looks wrong or whatever. So then I just continue drawing until I get it right, or maybe I get closer to what that is, whatever it is that I'm trying to diagram. But like kind of doing it in your head, it's very difficult. Like you almost have to have this thing that's on paper that kind of reflects it back to you, shows you what it looks like, how you can manipulate it, how you can enhance it, refine it, whatever,
the responsive stage of the constructive project.
Right. Like you just, to me, that's it's really like absolutely necessary, to not just to drawing comics, but to kind of like artistic and kind of human activity in a way, it's kind of built in. It's the technology of being human, it's like at some point, like, we just started taking shit from the world and making things out of it, and then it gave us another idea, and then it became this ongoing thing that's like created the world around us.
It's interesting to think that all of these things that we're talking about, including the fact that we're talking about this, might just be a mechanism of essentially like how to calibrate our bodies against the world, and having a relatively weak offensive system, but being an apex predator, we are able to adapt these things against us, and then being able to transfer those skills to other human beings. So you could even see the entire human social project in a sense as an extension of our abilities to take a branch and make it a spear, and then transfer that ability to our brethren.
Right. So at some point, the spear becomes the stylus, and then you can write with it, and then you can, instead of spearing an animal, you're kind of like spearing ideas, like getting them down on paper or on cave walls or whatever. And this activity is very, very old, like we have, and this is something that's like a pet project right now, just reading a lot about deep history and like really going back in time on how these concepts formed. But I don't know if you saw it, there was like a recent kind of archaeological discovery where they realized that a lot of the cave paintings that we've seen, the sort of the stuff that goes back 30, 40,000 years, there are these little weird marks there on all of these things, and they have figured out what those marks mean, and they actually mean that it's actually a calendar, and there's always like a Y in a certain spot. And the Y is actually like, that's when the animal breeds, the Y is like the splitting.
The split.
Wild.
So, and this goes back like,
30, 40,000
years, and it's something that's on all the cave walls, all over Europe and wherever else, that's been there. We've seen these little marks, these little hatch marks and things, and these little Ys. And this one guy like figured it out and figured out that like, oh yeah, this animal, whenever this Y shows up, we know from biology that this is when the animal reproduces, and so all this stuff is there, and there's all kinds of other marks that we don't know what their meanings, but they are marks. They're like X's, they're little circles, whatever. Like a lot of those things may have had meanings that we don't know today. They were probably much more kind of hieroglyphic in a sense that they had some kind of like kind of rebus-like kind of understanding of what this is, that was passed down, for generations and generations.
In like doing research into that stuff, probably nowhere near as deeply as you have, but something I was very surprised about is that I noticed that the earlier examples of human art production tended to be more highly representational, and then as history goes on, it starts to become more hieroglyphic. That surprised me. I would have thought that we started with the simpler abstract marks, but then once I saw it, like when I was putting together lectures on the history of design and stuff, I'm like, oh wait, yeah, that makes sense. At first we're starting representational, and then we get to those abstract concepts. And even like you said, the rebus, at first we didn't have the phonetic language, so you would draw, if you wanted the I noise, you would draw the I symbol, and that led to phonetic. So seeing that like compression down from representation to abstraction, and then kind of the bifurcation of the two is really interesting to me. And you seem really explicitly operating like comics are the thing where you kind of can like go back
Pull
to that
the
gap.
strands back.
Right.
And that's, I mean, you make that fairly explicit in the newest cartoon dialectics, not just because you have this comics as technology of consciousness essay, but also like the comics timeline, which I quite enjoyed how it intrudes on the the narrative in the pagination sense. Is that a
Yeah, I mean, I just, I really just, like, I was reading about all this stuff and I just kept taking notes, and I'm like, but I don't really know how, like how it fits into the general timeline. So I just started putting marks on a timeline, in an InDesign document. And then eventually I just kind of like made this chart, and there's already things that I need to like move, and there's other things that I need to add. This was done before that little discovery that literally just happened like 2 months ago or something like that.
Mhm.
About the notches and the decades. So I want to add that kind of stuff in there. But yeah, it's just kind of I just wanted to, again, like visualize it for myself. And then also I insert like weird things in there, like Atlantis and stuff like that. Like I kind of want to have like, I kind of want to have a reference for like, okay, when these fictional things were happening, supposedly, or, or et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So it's like, it's kind of an interesting way to look at the world. Like, one kind of, one influence on that is I don't know if you ever read Manuel de Landa. He's like he's kind of like a Deleuzian philosopher, but he also comes from I think he comes from architecture and design. But he has a book that's really great. It's called 1,000 Years of Nonlinear History. So and he kind of talks about I think he starts basically with year 0 or no, year 1000, and then goes to the present. If I remember correctly, it's been a while since I read it, but he kind of goes through like geological stuff that happened. He goes through like, sociological stuff, political stuff, just kind of like layers all these different histories, and really kind of opens up a lot of interesting things. Like, why did this thing happen? Why did this thing happen? Well, actually, there was a lot of crazy shit going on. Volcanoes were going off, blah, blah, blah. Like all this stuff is a lot of these things used to be kind of like separated, right? Like you would have a geological history, you'd have a political history, whatever. But today, especially like sort of in light of the world that we live in, kind of bringing all these things back and seeing how these things can influence each other is kind of really important. And that's something I'm doing for myself, for sort of in this comics research that I'm doing, kind of like seeing what else is going on in the world at the same time. Like most comics histories go back to Topfer, and it's great because like it makes sense because he sort of like kind of really codified it in a way that was not done before. But a lot of the kind of the basic structures went back further, and that's something I struggled with for a while because like McCloud kind of goes back in time in understanding comics, right? He kind of goes back to the Egyptians and the cave art and stuff like that.
The Arc de Triomphe or the
he talks about the Trajan's column.
Although
like
once again, and you go visit that in person. I mean, you're not going to read the fucking thing; it's up in the sky.
Sure. I mean, I get it. Like, but it's not exactly the same thing, but there is
Greek friezes. Like all those things are legit narrative archetype.
Right. And I'm trying to think about it a little bit broader. Like it's not just I don't want to call that comics specifically because there's definitely a break between those things and comics.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a kind of visual communication kind of aspect to it that essentially was absorbed into comics. You know what I mean? So like that stuff is in a way a subset of comics, and you can make a case for it. If you take the column and you and you pull it out and make it into a linear narrative, because that's easy to read. So, that's so I'm trying to be a little bit more open about that stuff because initially I think I kind of was like, Scott McCloud, you're going back too far. I was much more like comics is a specific in a way that's like kind of a more Marxist analysis is like, okay, comics is like a very specific emergent technology that comes out of print and like industrial technology, et cetera, et cetera. It's like there's a kind of a material industrial base that can create comics, and now that's why comics exist in a way.
Sure,
But that, you know, and that's
an
true.
economic or social classist argument that's not necessarily engaging with comics as an information technology. Like
Right. Exactly.
Like your list includes like a superimposition of successive images, which is a perfect example. You're right, because until someone does that, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Right. It's that you're back into like, why does that guy have a bunch of lines on his face?
Right.
Like interpretive things that are required. I'm calling it a technology, but I suppose, you could see it as a cultural transmission thing again, where someone needs to have been transmitted this in order for that to be decoded as a valid communication form. Right. This is interesting. Go back to the cave paintings, because of course, one of the other kind of leading, competitive theories to the idea that these are like scattershot, basically collages of kills or whatever, that these cave paintings might have done is the theory that there are certain lighting conditions that they would have been seen under, and that, if you imagine these things under like torchlight,
flickering light
with a sputtering torch, that there's some amount of motion to those not just superimpositions, but that you're seeing some kind of leaping motion.
No, I mean, that's there's a couple of theories out there who basically, say that like we invented cinema before we invented anything else. You know what I mean? It's they definitely had a thing. And there's another really interesting kind of inquiry into this stuff through the invention of camera obscura. Like, when did that invention actually occur? Because there are actually naturally occurring camera obscuras in the world, especially in some caves.
Yeah.
And then you also can kind of imagine it inside of like a tent, like a made out of opaque animal skins or whatever. A small pinhole can actually project an image on a wall, and then some of the paintings like bear the marks of essentially somebody tracing a camera obscura, because like there is a kind of a distortion to the image that would only happen if like that image was projected on this weird angle or whatever, you know what I mean?
That makes a lot of sense, because that's like what I was saying, those early ones do seem more representational. So the fact that you're not processing it mentally, but it's purely a physical process, like you have in one of the books, the spitting the pigment at the hand, and those kind of straight up tracing processes make a lot of sense. And it goes to the Sean, you pointed out the technology of consciousness. I really liked in that the idea that digital man is returning to the primitive man in some sense, because we've gone back to that audio visual culture versus the like Gutenberg linear print culture.
And try to tie both those things together. There's a certain aspect of magic to something when we get to the point where we have it right now, where, you and I just call each other and don't have to engage in any of the specifics of it. You're just here in the room. Similarly, you can imagine that these kind of cave theories don't have to be explicitly one or the other. That somebody might have happened upon the flickering aspect of this looks like it's leaping, and then liked the superimposition. In other words, that these things don't have to be mutually exclusive. You might find your path in, and then have that part of your repertoire going forward. These images can exist; these can coexist simultaneously. I can draw 15 of these on the paper. Similarly to the fact that Muybridge goes and figures out how to photograph at a faster speed, and figures out how to trip out all these different things, and just sees the motion itself, and that's the thing he's interested in, whereas you've got this whole other thing that's like waiting as a result of the thing that he did. No, exactly. I don't know what to answer on this one. It's kind of like two different questions in a way, but you're kind of bringing it together. I'm interested in all that, and as you were saying, Carson, like there is like this digitalness is in a way bringing us back to certain modes of being that that sort of existed prior to literacy,
And in a way, like all that sort of the AI stuff with the AI writing, even the AI drawing, kind of brings us back into into weird like non-literate states, because like you no longer have to even really write. You just kind of like you just have to do a few incantations, and then stuff gets spit out at you. And I can totally see that, we're probably, and I think America already has undergone its first like few years where literacy rates have gone down already, from their peaks. I can definitely see kind of a place where we just, we're kind of like stochastically literate. We know enough to like read something. We know enough to like write a few things, but like we don't really know like the full language, So in a way, it's like probably, like say like literacy was in Egypt and China and Sumer. There were all these characters, right? There's like thousands and thousands of characters that correspond to different concepts and things like that. And it's like a very literary culture there. But the average person only probably knows a few characters, where it's like, okay, they know the numbers, maybe they know a few like simple symbols that kind of inform them of what's going on here or there,
or enable them to trade at the market,
right?
Or
exactly,
them to not get killed by the soldiers,
to sign a contract or whatever. But then like the scribes and the philosophers and the priests or whatever, they all they have this much larger and richer kind of understanding of
the bookkeepers
of literature and of concepts and all this stuff.
And that like bottleneck that I was describing, there we go, I got to get the screen right, of like down to abstraction and into representation. I see it going the other way now with the technology, like you're talking about the pictographic language. More and more and more and more people are just using emojis, which is going back the other way. And I've seen walking around, the first time I saw this like 4 or 5 years ago in a classroom, I walked around and someone was scrolling through their phone with their contacts, and they didn't have people's names. They just had emoji strings for different people. Like so-and-so is like smiley face, champagne bottle, cucumber, water spurt. And then someone else is like another string of emojis. And I was like, what is that? And they were like, oh, these are my friends. Like that's how they're identifying people now, which is
if I call this person, I'll be smiling. If I call this person, I'll be frowning.
Yeah, that's what it was. That's what it looked like. It was like a string of pictorial representations of their encounters with the person.
Right. I mean, so in a way, it's like we've gone, in a way, we had to kind of like, we had to simplify those early languages, the hieroglyphic languages. We had to simplify them to like to disseminate them. But now with digital technology, we can all of a sudden kind of like repopulate it with all these new things, all these little conceptual bits and pieces that are now just kind of apprehended in a single image.
You see it on Twitter. If you are not familiar with the culture of the particular element that you're looking at, there's a whole world that's just basically gibberish. You can step into someone else's gibberish. It's like this. People have taken the specialized language of plumbers or something, and drilled it down and applied it to every possible subset you can have. And anybody that has any kind of political affiliation or particular cultural interest or whatever will have this whole branching vocabulary of not only words but incidents that they can refer to in shorthand or whatever.
Either through like different emojis, different signs, or even just like popping in memes or whatever that like it's like, what does this image mean? I have no idea. Like I don't know what this is referring to.
So the specialization has gotten so extreme. That's a very interesting thought.
The other thing that goes with it is just like we got stuck in the linearity because that allowed us to document. Right, the more simple language and then the Gutenberg press allowed us to document and distribute, where until we got the digital technologies, we couldn't document and distribute and preserve. Like this conversation would have just been lost to the wind. And so you see, like, people worry about literacy going away, and it's like, well, as long as we still have linguistics, I don't know, because the literacy was there as a preservation technology. And of course it has certain benefits, but I really think that now that we have a preservation technology for audiovisual, we're seeing that we're an audiovisual creature, and that language was always abnormal for us. And now that we can preserve what's normal for us, we're like, please, like, trying to get kids to read books is terrible, but they're fuck around on their phone all day.
Yeah, it's an interesting, the counter argument to that, and as brief as I can make it, would be just that there's a vast inefficiency of delivery in a video or audio format in a huge subset of topics, especially if you speed read, if you don't audiate. So like, for instance, like when I'm reading, I don't audiate unless I'm reading for pleasure. So I can read much faster than I can hear because I'm just, the speed that my eyes can move is the speed that I can take in the information. Right. And the only reason I need to slow down is if it's a concept that I'm not familiar with, that's like deeply unfamiliar. And so, there would be no reason for me to ever watch I don't know, video series about the, development of I'm actually gonna not pick something on the fly as a topic here, because on the contrary, if you're reading about animals, you have no idea what the fuck you're talking about, because you can just read the numbers. Sure. But seeing it or smelling it or touching it is so much more significant that it dominates the thing. Watching a 15-second YouTube clip about a hippo is probably worth reading about hippos for an hour, right?
Maybe not. Like you see the hippo, you laugh, you go away, you forgot that hippos even exist. You know what I mean? Like it's one of these things like where I don't know if this worries me, but like it's more of I definitely see this kind of from a McLuhan point of view, Marshall McLuhan. Yeah. Where like audio and visual things really like heat things up for us in a way. So like seeing something. So like, let's say you use the video as an example, like, okay, you can watch videos on all kinds of topics, right? But they, almost never can they get like really deep, right? Like the video is going to be very, very long, and it's going to be very exhausting to watch that. And then also you can just be like, oh, I don't like the way that guy looks. Like, I'm not going to listen to this, like there's going to be all kinds of other cues that may like discourage you from actually ever looking at this information, and text kind of like cools everything down, and actually kind of allows you kind of the space, like without having someone like be there in front of you. That's maybe you see this person as like very judgmental or like bloviating or whatever. Like you can give them all kinds of other kind of characteristics that the text doesn't give you, and you can kind of absorb that information in a kind of at a distance in a way. What I mean?
There's like less accidental rhetoric. Basically,
yeah. I mean, this is why rhetoric used to be such an important discipline. That's exactly what I was thinking. Because every nobody read before. Like you were read too. People just would, whenever Plato had a new thing, he wouldn't be like, let's print these up. He was just like, okay, let's you go out there and read this thing, or let's talk about it in the square or whatever. And then you had to deliver it in such a way where people would actually absorb the information and sometimes they wouldn't want to listen to you. There was some other guy over there, and they had a bigger crowd. You go over there, and you talk to that guy. Yeah. So so like the audio visual, like it's
I like the hot and
there's
cold.
There's a lot of kind of there's a lot of good that comes with that, because that's how we interact with each other. We have these human things that we can do. We can communicate all these different things non-verbally, but at the same time, like you can't really do that with like particle physics or something like that. I mean? Like there's this whole disciplines where you kind of need to visualize these concepts without looking at the mathematician. You know what I mean?
And those disciplines weren't possible without that more linear technology, because it's a linear. It is McLuhan, right? The medium is the message.
Yeah, exactly.
Like you have to be in a linear medium to be able to think those thoughts. So I think it's a venue thing. It's just what's the best venue for the communication.
Similarly, this is going to be the video where we lose 200 subscribers because people don't like the way I sit in a chair or I'm chewing gum.
Yeah.
'Cause
that
I
happens.
only like him when I could see only his shoulders up.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of it. There's definitely cues like that, because I will, like, if I'm listening to someone who's giving a lecture but they have like a pasty mouth,
Yeah.
like, there's lecture series like at Yale, freely available lecture series. This is really interesting, and I'll get halfway through and I'll fuck this, like, because I'm really audio sensitive, and that's correct. But if that guy wrote a book, I would pick it up. And then McLuhan too, is, I think, your digital primitive guy. Is that coming from McLuhan in a sense?
That's partly McLuhan, partly Ballard. Ballard always has like kind of like this like ferment of like primitive desire that's underneath modern civilizations. I feel like that's maybe comes from that, but then it's more refined in McLuhan. I read some McLuhan early on in college, but I kind of left it on the table. And then recently I reread the Gutenberg Galaxy, and I was just kind of like blown away again. Just kind of like remembered where a lot of these concepts were coming from, and where all that's all that kind of medium stuff. He's really good at describing it and kind of like historicizing it in a very specific way.
And he talks about that like third world countries are hotter cultures, and so they're more ready to pick up the hot medium of digital tech, or he calls it electronic technology, because he's talking about television, but they're more ready because they're still already a hot culture. And the westernized cultures, which are colder cultures or more linear cultures, are going to go through, and we're seeing this now, a crisis, because we're reintroducing something that's kind of counter to how we've been operating since.
Right. Yeah, we've built like whole social norms and ways of being around this stuff, in a way that's like now kind of breaking down in some ways, because of all this stuff. You're exactly right there. There are cultures that have never gone through kind of the sort of mass literacy and mass, like, mass, everybody has newspapers, everybody has everything. And they're going to kind of adapt to this stuff in very different ways.
I worked briefly with a tech company that was reaching essentially like third world environments with text messaging for various goals, some of which were nice and some of which were avaricistic. It was interesting because they just had to completely rejigger the way that they talked to people. It wasn't just like a cultural thing. It was like someone's relationship with their phone is completely different in a completely different environment. It's a different world, keeping that like verbal distinction of third world is a very interesting distinction that this is another world. It's definitely like, it's not just a cultural thing. It really is some kind of shift that happens when
they probably find that they do better using TikTok or some video. Audio visual.
There were some technological limitations at the time, but I think that was one of the conclusions they were coming to.
I think a lot of phones in the sort of the less developed world, they're mostly text only, like they have low connectivity. So there's,
because the bandwidth is so low. The local bandwidth. I wanted to read this portion of this essay just to kind of, because this is the thing that I read this and I was like, if Carson has not read any of your comics, like, this is going to be the thing that just goes. The mind of the digital man is a new form of the primitive mind. The digital man is immersed in the world through the screen, mirror, and the microphone, speaker, headphone. Images and voices surround the digital man, but he can never be sure of their reality. The primitive man was immersed in the society through direct physical relations with his tribe. On the other hand, the digital man is interpenetrated by the social as opposed to society through remote, technologically enabled communication. Alienation, disembodiment reach new levels when the world shrinks to the size of a screen, and surround sound does not match the surroundings. Forget the mind-body split. We've become entirely disembodied, ethereal, and unreal. Primary animal functions like sex, eating, and socializing become tortured rituals mediated by the technological social, which, connected to the raw nerve of the internet, births new alienated bodies without organs. Instead of being social, we are injected with social algorithms. Welcome to the transhuman algorithmic swarm future. How do we avoid this thing?
I've never heard this read aloud, so
It's fantastic, man.
Yeah.
It's fantastic. Absolutely.
I mean, the reason
many
why we'll have to have
strands
Tom
here.
back so many times is like I could probably go on, especially with cartoon dialectics. I mean, I have notes like on every page almost, and I could go on each one of those for a whole hour for
Yeah,
sure.
it's a struggle. Like you've managed something so dense there. This is kind of why I was going to ask you about spot color and stuff.
yeah,
And
but
why
then,
I'm like,
you
hell no.
say, yeah, you say the word dense, and that's like actually like that's one other kind of aspect to the work that I always try to like work in. I like a certain density of information, you know, like it's hard for me to like decompress, you know, so like, you know, a lot of like manga or a lot of modern comics have this very decompressed storytelling where there's very, you know, very little happens for you know, for many pages. And in my work, I always kind of have a certain, you know, preference for density. Although I really try to like decompress sometimes, but it's like sometimes it's like way too much crammed in there. So
Well, but you in this case, I mean, you've got that essay versus something where like the pictographic work where, you know, the density is on the motion, panel to panel motion, instead of, you know, it's conceptually dense,
yeah,
as opposed to visually dense.
Right,
And
right,
I think that those things work together. It's one of the reasons that I'm really curious about like what form Transterra ends up taking, because it feels like you're generating enough raw material that your organizational abilities, you're going to have an infinite variety of possibilities. So that it seems to me that the real problem is going to be to limit you to come up with a conceptual framework that allows you to incorporate everything that makes sense
yeah,
without driving yourself nuts, you know, like Orson
Yeah.
Welles' Don Quixote style,
yeah.
where it's just are you familiar with the Don Quixote project?
Yeah, I mean, I know a little bit about it, and you know, and then you know, obviously Orson Welles is the first to kind of like go crazy in a large project that just never kind of gels in the end because of, you know, mission creep, conceptual creep, whatever,
Right.
you know, like but yeah, you know, I'm, you know, I definitely feel like I'm a little bit in that zone right now, but it's also a productive zone. Like I'm getting a lot of stuff done, I'm putting stuff out there. So I'm trying not to limit myself too much, but I am trying to like sort of like find the path to the end, you know, like where I can kind of where I can go. And it, you know, the work really starts with like kind of an in the smaller mini comics which are out of print. It really starts with utopia, like with the idea of utopia, and in a way, like I kind of, that's kind of where I want to return eventually at some point. And in a way, like, you know, this idea of like Atlantis, we mentioned Atlantis a little bit. Like Atlantis is kind of like the lost world, right? The golden age, the lost world. You know, like did it happen? Did it not happen? Who knows? It doesn't matter. And then the utopia is this like world that has yet to happen. And it's also, you know, it's sort of like, and it also sits on this like, you know, if Atlantis is real or not real, you know, obviously there's, you know, archaeologists will tell you it's not real. Other people will tell you it's real, but you know, to me, ultimately it doesn't matter. It's just kind of like Heisenberg, you know, like, you know, it's both alive and dead for me. And then utopia is in sort of in the same way, kind of like vacillates between, you know, sort of a utopian future and an apocalyptic future. You know, it's kind of this flicker between the two. You know, utopia, dystopia. So I kind of want to, you know, sort of kind of get that all in there somehow, and kind of bookend this thing somehow.
Well, and that's where I guess we'll have to, because I know, Sean, you got a music lesson coming up soon, but that's also, you're talking about dialectics, so that's, I think, the next conversation we have to have is what, like, explain that term. Why are you using it in the book? Because you are setting up these two things that have two elements apiece already having a dialectic between them, and then you're putting them in a dialectic with each other, it sounds like.
Well, you actually work into the story directly, the history of is it Thomas More's Utopia?
Yeah.
And doesn't that utopia literally means impossible?
Right, or no place.
No place. Thank you.
Yeah, a place that doesn't exist.
So the first utopia, as imagined in using the word, is literally not possible in the estimation.
Well, it
of this
depends
author.
on where you want to put the first utopia, because you could say that in some ways Plato's Atlantis is kind of the first utopia slash dystopia, and that it's also kind of a, is it real? Is it not real? But at least he does give it a real place in the world. It is supposedly an island outside the Pillars of Hercules or whatever. So there is supposedly something that actually was realized, at least according to the narrative. Again, I'm not gonna speculate on the reality or unreality of that. But then and then Sir Thomas More, in a way, like he kind of picks up this baton and kind of creates this new word, utopia, no place. And he does actually situate his utopia in the new world somewhere, like it's some island around the Americas. So he does give it sort of a place on the planet, even if it's not real, right? Although the title obviously gives you a clue that it's not, that it's imaginary. And then there's other writers later on that sort of like built on this. Some add the letter E to the beginning, so it's utopia, which is the good place. So there is there's kind of ways that people have kind of like played with this. But I think to me those things are kind of like on the same continuum in a way, and sort of like the destruction of Atlantis is also like that's the dystopia, right? It's like kind of almost built into that first story. That first story is both utopia and dystopia, and then our utopias are kind of flicker between these two possibilities, I mean that's kind of the dialectics, I guess, here between those things. And you can kind of think about it on a scale of time, or you can think about it as conceptual things, continuums, and et cetera. But yeah.
And Plato's Republic, I don't know that it's utopian, but it's definitely an attempt to build an ideal society. But I mean, to all of us, I would think it would seem entirely dystopian, because he's going to get rid of all the poets and the artists. But it's not like no one was trying to craft ideal social structures.
Well,
I mean, we've always been doing that.
Yeah, I'll give Plato credit, because one thing to kind of remember about, like like a lot of times when we say like, oh, he wanted to get rid of poets and artists or whatever, is we kind of think about it like art today, like we want to ban certain kind of art or whatever. Maybe we think about like the Nazis banning the sort of the degenerate art or whatever, something like that. But Plato, like you have to kind of like think back, like what's the kind of art that's there, and what kind of function it performed, and how did it do certain things. And like a lot of art was, poetry wasn't written, it was spoken, right? So there was a lot of, so the way it was absorbed by the people, the way it was sort of like processed, what I think he really wanted to ban was mimetic contagion. What I mean? In a way that
Interesting.
Like a certain poet or whatever would have a certain kind of like effect on people in the way that the sorrows of young Werther, like Goethe, had that effect on young people, where they wanted to commit suicides after that book, right? So it's this mimetic contagion of like this piece of art that like just kind of takes you out of yourself and makes you kind of intensely identify with these things. And I think that's really what he wanted to kind of like to ban. It wasn't like I just hate poetry, but like poetry that will like turn you into whatever, like a crazy person.
Yeah. So poet. So basically, Plato wanted to ban shonen harem manga.
Sure.
Well, yeah, but he also basically says like, look, I love Homer. Homer's my favorite thing, but he has the gods like fucking and being bad, and we don't want to teach the kids the lessons of our gods being like adulterers and rapists. And I give all my students a bit of the Republic where he's talking about painters as basically the lowest on the totem pole, because they just represent the look of something,
Right.
and that the carpenter who actually builds it is closer to the thing. So he has a not a distaste, but a suspicion of representation as encouraging people to accept lies and things
maybe
like
maybe
that.
he had a suspicion of responsive or of constructive art versus responsive art.
Maybe.
Yeah, no, I'm sure you can. Yeah, I'm sure you can draw certain kinds of hierarchies here. I mean, we do this now too. Like a lot of, in in philosophy, critical theory, etc. Like there is a certain we whenever we are kind of engaging with those disciplines, we kind of there is a kind of a critical component, and we criticize whatever's whatever architecture, art, whatever. And then there's obviously like a component of us out there who are like, oh, this is bullshit. The art is the thing, right? Like the art is the important thing. To criticize something is to just kind of like step away and not participate. Whereas when you participate, you actually understand like the effort, the how much time it takes, et cetera, et cetera. Like you give a very different idea of how to criticize the art. Like as a teacher, I don't know if you see this, but like when you see a student kind of develop over time, like you almost like it's really difficult to just critique the art as like an object that you just encountered. You kind of critique it as something that like this person just made, and you understand their process, how they got here, right? Instead of like just seeing it cold and being like, this is bullshit, or great or whatever. And the same goes with like economic stuff, etc. Like there's always like a remove for the stuff from the thing itself, right? From the economical processes, etc., etc. Like those things always outpace philosophy in a way, because they're just happening, they're just being done, they're just being made. And the critical work, the work of like thinking about it, etc., is always sort of like a post dates it. It's always like and this is part of the problem with like political philosophy, I think, because we're always fighting like previous battles. Like we're finally understand a moment in time, like, oh, 10 years ago this happened, like we get it, but like the stuff's moved on already, and we've already like there's something new that's still not quite understood, that we we understand it only in the context of the thing from 10 years ago or whatever. So there's this kind of like disconnect. I don't know why I got on this topic.
This is gonna happen in all of our conversations. I can promise.
We have permission to talk about anything we want within the time frame that we have, which is we have reached the end of.
We're done.
But
sorry, go ahead.
No. I didn't have anything to say other than to like if you made it this far through the conversation, you owe it to yourself to basically pick up everything that Tom has in print right now. And I hope that you've done that anyway. I hope that you paused this multiple times in the discussion. Tom, if you will come back at some point, and
happy to.
Really love to talk publishing with you. To whatever extent we can. I love to talk, like some mechanics and stuff with you, and especially I hear that you have some Jack Kirby art.
I do have a couple of original Jack Kirby's, yes.
Wow.
That might be fun to take a look at and sort of.
And I still got all these notes in cartoon dialectics. We just talked about
to do a
beta
video
testing.
just about cartoon dialectics. We can do that.
Yeah, for sure. Because that series is really, that's the one that I had a shitload of notes in. So we've got at least like 4 more videos to do.
Yeah, I'm game. I live nearby. It's all good. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, I know Sean's got to go teach. So thank you so much, Tom. And thank you everyone for watching, and have a good one, guys.
Yeah, really appreciate it, guys. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Make sure to like, smash that subscribe button, and ring that bell.